On a shimmering June morning in 1904, the Lower East Side of Manhattan was a cacophony of brass bands and German laughter. This was Kleindeutschland, Little Germany, the vibrant heart of New York's immigrant soul. Over 1,300 people, mostly mothers in their finest white eyelet lace and children clutching picnic baskets, paraded toward the 3rd Street Pier. They were members of St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, heading out for their 17th annual excursion. Their vessel was the P.S. General Slocum, a triple-decker side-wheeled steamboat that looked like a floating Victorian palace, gleaming with fresh white paint and gold trim. As the band played the Star-Spangled Banner, the massive paddle wheels churned the East River, and the ship began its journey toward a picnic grove on Long Island. It was the social event of the year, but the Slocum was a brightly painted lie. Beneath the festive atmosphere, the ship was a rotting tinderbox. Its captain, William Van Schaik, was 67 years old and had never conducted a fire drill in the ship's 13-year history. The crew consisted of untrained day laborers who didn't even know how to lower a lifeboat. Worse yet, the safety equipment was a product of corporate greed. The fire hoses were made of cheap, unlined linen that had sat rotting in the sun. They were so fragile they would burst under the slightest pressure. Most horrifyingly, the life jackets were a death trap. To meet federal weight requirements cheaply, the manufacturer had filled the canvas vests with granulated cork and heavy iron bars. As the Slocum reached the Hell Gate, a treacherous stretch of water known for its violent currents, a spark ignited in a forward storage room filled with oily rags and straw. A young boy screamed "Fire!" but the crew, lacking any training, panicked. They tried to use the hoses, but the linen snapped instantly, spraying water everywhere except on the flames. Captain Van Schaik, instead of grounding the boat on the nearby Manhattan shore, made the catastrophic decision to maintain full speed into the wind toward North Brother Island. This turned the ship into a massive blowtorch. The wind fanned the flames backward, trapping 1,000 women and children at the stern. The scene turned into a vision of hell. The heat was so intense it melted the lead paint off the railings. Mothers, desperate to save their babies, strapped the heavy life vests onto them and tossed them into the river. They watched in silent, paralyzed horror as their children sank like stones, dragged to the bottom by the very iron weights meant to certify the vests. Those who stayed on board faced a collapsing deck. The sun-dried wood gave way, dropping hundreds of people directly into the roaring furnace of the engine room. By the time the burning hull finally grounded on the rocks of North Brother Island, the river was white with the lace of Sunday dresses.
The aftermath was a tragedy that erased an entire culture. The official death toll was 1,021, the greatest loss of civilian life in New York's history until September 11, 2001. Because the victims all lived within the same few blocks, Kleindeutschland was spiritually broken. Every storefront wore a black wreath. Men like Gottlieb Lehr, a local baker, lost their wives and every single one of their children in that 1 hour. The survivors couldn't bear the ghosts of their neighborhood. Within a year, the Germans abandoned the East Side, moving to the Bronx or Queens. Little Germany simply vanished from the map of Manhattan. Captain Van Schaik was eventually sentenced to 10 years in Sing Sing, while the ship's owners escaped with minor fines. Today, the tragedy is mostly forgotten by the public, but it remains the reason for every modern maritime safety law in the United States. In Tompkins Square Park, a small, faded marble fountain stands as the only marker for a community that went out for a picnic and never came home. The silence that followed the General Slocum disaster was perhaps more haunting than the screams on the river. In the days after the burning hull settled into the mud of North Brother Island, the East Village became a city of ghosts. For blocks, every single tenement door was draped in heavy black crepe. It wasn't just a tragedy of individuals, it was the sudden, violent decapitation of a culture. because the victims were almost entirely women and children, the keepers of the home and the future of the lineage. The German men who returned from work that day found themselves standing in silent apartments filled with half-eaten breakfasts and unmade beds. One man, a local baker, lost his wife and all 5 of his children in a single hour. He was found days later wandering the halls of his home, calling their names into the empty air. The legal battle that followed was a masterclass in Gilded Age corruption. While the city wept, the Knickerbocker Steamship Company scrambled to protect its profits. During the investigation, it was discovered that the new life preservers were actually 13 years old, their cork filling having crumbled into flammable dust. To ensure they passed inspection, the manufacturer had inserted 7-inch iron bars inside the canvas. When mothers strapped these onto their children and tossed them into the East River, they weren't giving them life jackets, they were giving them anchors. Despite this evidence, no executive from the company ever spent a day in jail. Only the aging, half-blind Captain Van Schaik was used as a scapegoat, sentenced to 10 years in Sing Sing prison, while the men who authorized the rotten equipment walked free. By 1905, the physical scars of the fire began to fade, but the psychological ones were permanent. The survivors could no longer bear the sight of the streets where they once heard their children playing. The grief of the Germans triggered a mass exodus. Within 24 months, the bakeries, the beer gardens, and the German language signs were torn down or painted over. A neighborhood that had taken 50 years to build vanished in less than 2. It was replaced by a new wave of Jewish and Italian immigrants who had no memory of the white steamship or the smell of burning lead paint. The vibrant little Germany was erased from the map of Manhattan, leaving behind only a few stone carvings of German names high atop the old brick buildings, silent headstones for a vanished civilization. Today, if you walk through Tompkins Square Park, you might stumble upon a small, weathered marble fountain. It is often ignored by the tourists and the locals, but if you look closely, you will see 2 children carved into the stone, looking out toward the water. It is the only physical marker of the day the music stopped. The disaster forced the United States to create the modern Coast Guard and implement the strict maritime safety laws we have today, but the cost was the soul of a city. The story of the General Slocum remains a chilling reminder that in the face of corporate greed and systemic neglect, even the brightest summer morning can turn into a nightmare that echoes for a century. The investigation that followed the sinking revealed a level of corporate negligence that horrified the American public. Divers who went down to the wreckage found something chilling. The new life jackets that had failed so spectacularly were actually filled with cork dust, essentially sawdust and waste that had become waterlogged and heavy over time. To ensure they met the legal weight requirement of 6 pounds during inspection, the manufacturers had slipped heavy iron bars inside the canvas. When mothers strapped these onto their children, they were unwittingly turning their babies into anchors. Despite this evidence, no executive from the company ever spent a day in jail. Only the aging, half-blind Captain Van Schaik was used as a scapegoat, sentenced to 10 years in Sing Sing prison, while the men who authorized the rotten equipment walked free.
The courtroom drama was equally grim. While the families of the victims demanded justice, the owners of the Knickerbocker Steamship Company used their political connections to shield themselves. They faced no criminal charges for the rotten equipment or the bribed inspectors. Instead, the entire weight of the law fell upon the 67-year-old Captain Van Schaik. He was sentenced to 10 years in Sing Sing prison. Though he was eventually pardoned by President Taft years later, he remained the only person to pay for the deaths of over 1,000 people. As the months turned into years, the physical scars on the Manhattan shoreline healed, but the social fabric of Little Germany was permanently shredded. The trauma was so deep that the community simply gave up.
Men who had lost their entire families could not bear to walk past the empty playgrounds and silent schools of the Lower East Side. By 1910, the German signs were taken down, replaced by Yiddish and Italian as a new wave of immigrants moved in. The vibrant city within a city evaporated, leaving behind only the stone-carved names of German builders on the cornices of tenements. Today, the General Slocum is often called the tragedy that New York forgot. It was quickly overshadowed by the sinking of the Titanic in 1912 and the anti-German sentiment of World War I, which made many survivors hide their heritage. However, every time you step onto a commercial ferry or cruise ship today, you are protected by the laws written in the blood of the Slocum victims. The mandatory fire drills, the accessible lifeboats, and the rigorous inspection of life jackets are the invisible legacy of that terrible June morning. The final crushing blow to the community of Kleindeutschland wasn't just the fire itself, but the silence that followed. For years, the German families of the Lower East Side had been the backbone of New York's middle class, the bakers, the cabinet makers, and the musicians. But after June 15, 1904, the music simply stopped. The Slocum survivors became a tragic fraternity of broken men. Because the victims were almost entirely women and children, a generation of German-American men found themselves living in widower houses, entire tenement buildings where not a single child's voice could be heard. The psychological trauma was so localized and so intense that the neighborhood suffered a collective nervous breakdown. By 1910, the exodus was complete. Those who could afford to leave moved north to Yorkville or out to the suburbs of Queens, desperate to escape the grief street of Avenue A. The magnificent St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, which had organized the ill-fated picnic, saw its congregation evaporate. The building was eventually sold and became a synagogue, marking the literal end of the German era in the East Village. The physical traces of Little Germany were scrubbed away by the relentless tide of New York's evolution, replaced by the bustling markets of Yiddish-speaking immigrants who had no connection to the ghosts of the river. The General Slocum herself had a ghostly afterlife. The charred hull was raised from the mud near North Brother Island and sold to a company that stripped her of her finery, turning the once proud floating palace into a humble coal barge named the Maryland. For 7 years, the vessel that had been a funeral pyre for 1,000 people hauled soot and dirt up and down the Atlantic coast. In 1911, fittingly, she sank for the last time during a storm off the coast of New Jersey. There was no fanfare and no loss of life. The ship simply slipped beneath the waves, as if finally accepting its own dark history. The tragedy's most lasting impact, however, remains hidden in plain sight. Before the Slocum, maritime inspections were often a joke, a matter of a few dollars slid across a table to a corrupt official. Afterward, the United States government was forced to create the Steamboat Inspection Service, which eventually evolved into the modern U.S. Coast Guard. Every time you see a fire extinguisher on a ferry or a life jacket that actually floats, you are looking at a safety measure written in the blood of the children of St. Mark's.
Today, if you visit the northern end of Tompkins Square Park, you will find the Slocum Memorial Fountain. It is a quiet, modest piece of white marble. If you stand there long enough, you might notice that the fountain is rarely dry. Even a century later, people still leave small stones or flowers for the 1,021 souls who went out for a picnic and became a legend of American sorrow. The story of the General Slocum is the story of how a single hour of corporate greed and bad luck can erase 50 years of history, leaving a hole in a city that can never truly be filled. The tragedy of the General Slocum did not end when the fires were extinguished. It merely shifted from the river to the courtrooms and the quiet, grieving streets of Manhattan.
In the weeks following the disaster, New York City was gripped by a mixture of profound sorrow and white-hot rage. As the bodies of hundreds of children were pulled from the East River, many still clutching their picnic baskets or wearing their Sunday medals, the public demanded to know how a modern steamship could dissolve into a funeral pyre in less than 15 minutes. The investigation that followed peeled back the skin of Gilded Age corruption to reveal a skeletal system of greed. The testimony of the survivors was gut-wrenching. Mothers spoke of trying to pull life jackets from overhead racks, only to have the canvas tear like wet paper in their hands. They described the cork inside as a fine, gray powder that blew away in the wind, offering no buoyancy at all. It was later proven in court that the manufacturer, the Nonpareil Cork Works, had placed heavy iron weights inside the jackets to ensure they weighed the legal 6 pounds required by inspectors. This revelation transformed the disaster from a tragic accident into a mass murder. Yet, in a staggering display of corporate immunity, not a single executive from the Cork Company or the Knickerbocker Steamship Company was ever indicted for the faulty equipment. Captain William Van Schaik became the lightning rod for the city's fury. At 67, he was an old-school mariner who had spent his life on the water, but his failure to ever conduct a single fire drill was inexcusable. The prosecution painted him as a negligent relic of a bygone era. He was sentenced to 10 years in Sing Sing, a sentence that many felt was a convenient way for the big fish of the shipping industry to escape hooks. While Van Schaik sat in a prison cell, the families of Kleindeutschland were left to bury their dead in mass ceremonies that stretched for miles. The funeral procession for the victims of St. Mark's Church remains one of the largest in the history of the United States, a silent river of black carriages that signaled the end of an era. The long-term impact on the American psyche was subtle but permanent. Before the Slocum, the idea of government regulation was often seen as an unnecessary interference in private business. After the Slocum, that ideology died alongside the 1,021 victims. The disaster led directly to the passage of the Harder Act and massive overhauls in the Steamboat Inspection Service. It forced the federal government to realize that the safety of its citizens could not be left to the honor system of corporations. Every time a modern American boards a ferry and sees a clear map of emergency exits or a stack of certified, inspected life vests, they are benefiting from a safety culture that was paid for by the German immigrants of 1904. Today, the site of the disaster near North Brother Island is a forbidden zone, a bird sanctuary where the ruins of the old quarantine hospitals are slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The river there is quiet, the Hell Gate currents finally tamed by modern engineering. But for those who know the history, the air still feels heavy. The General Slocum is a reminder that the good old days were often built on a precarious risks. It is a story of a neighborhood that loved, celebrated, and vanished in the span of a single afternoon, leaving behind a legacy of safety that protects millions of people who have never even heard its name. The true tragedy of the General Slocum was not just the fire, but the silence that followed. For decades, the story of the 1,021 victims was buried under the weight of 2 world wars and a changing America. Because the victims were German Americans, and because the United States entered a brutal war against Germany only 13 years later, the public memory of Little Germany was intentionally suppressed. The German language was banned in many schools, and the survivors of the Slocum, already broken by grief, found it safer to hide their heritage than to mourn their lost neighborhood. However, the maritime world never forgot. The horror of the iron-weighted life jackets led to the first truly rigorous federal inspection system in United States history. Before 1904, inspectors were often bribed with a cigar and a few dollars to sign off on a ship's safety.
After the Slocum, the Steamboat Inspection Service was completely overhauled, eventually merging into the United States Coast Guard. Today, every time you see a modern life jacket with its high-visibility orange fabric and certified buoyancy foam, you are looking at a direct descendant of the failure on the East River. Even the geography of New York City was permanently altered. North Brother Island, where the burning ship finally ran aground, became a forbidden place. Once a site for quarantine hospitals where Typhoid Mary was famously held, it is now an abandoned bird sanctuary. The ruins of the hospitals are draped in ivy, and the shore where hundreds of bodies were pulled from the water is now silent, reclaimed by nature. It stands as a haunting mid-river monument to a day when the city's heart was torn out. The last survivor of the disaster, Adela Witherspoon, who was only 6 months old when her mother pushed her through a porthole into the arms of a rescuer, lived until 2004. With her passing, the direct living link to the General Slocum vanished. But the story remains a stark warning about the cost of corporate negligence and the fragility of community. A thriving, bustling culture of 50,000 people was erased by a single hour of bad decisions and cheap equipment. Today, the movie clips and History Gets Weird channels of the world still find this story fascinating because it feels like an impossible nightmare. It is a reminder that history isn't just a list of dates. It's the story of people who went out for a sunny picnic and ended up changing the laws of the ocean forever. The ghosts of Kleindeutschland may be gone, but their legacy is the safety of every passenger who sails the American waters today.
The legacy of the General Slocum finally transitioned from a living memory to a silent chapter of history on January 26, 2004, when the last survivor, Adela Witherspoon, passed away at the age of 100. Adela had been a 6-month-old infant when the fire broke out. Her mother had miraculously pushed her through a porthole into the arms of a rescuer before the ship was consumed. She spent her entire life as the primary keeper of the flame, attending every memorial service in Tompkins Square Park, ensuring that the names of the 1,021 victims were not erased by the passage of time. With her death, the direct human link to the grief of the Germans was severed, leaving the story to the archives and the ghosts of the East River. In the modern era, the disaster serves as a chilling case study in the normalization of deviance, a technical term for when a system slowly accepts dangerous shortcuts as normal until a catastrophe occurs. The Slocum had failed small inspections for years. Its crew had joked about the rotten hoses, and the captain had brushed off the lack of fire drills as a waste of time for a pleasure boat. This culture of complacency is now taught in maritime academies across the United States. Every cadet in the U.S. Merchant Marine today studies the Slocum not just as a tragedy, but as a warning. The Slocum laws that followed didn't just mandate better life jackets, they changed the very soul of American industry, moving it away from the lawless buyer beware attitude of the 19th century toward a modern era of consumer protection and corporate accountability. Geographically, the map of New York still bears the scars of that morning if you know where to look. North Brother Island, the final resting place of the ship's charred skeleton, remains one of the most mysterious places in the 5 boroughs. It is a strictly restricted no-man's land where the ruins of the Riverside Hospital are being swallowed by thick forest. Trees grow through the roofs of the wards where survivors were treated, and the shoreline is littered with rusted iron and decayed wood. It is a forbidden sanctuary for herons and cormorants, a silent mid-river graveyard that stands in stark contrast to the shimmering glass skyscrapers of Manhattan just a few miles away. The story of the General Slocum is the story of the high price of progress. It is a narrative of an immigrant community
that built a world of brass bands and beer gardens, only to see it incinerated in less than 15 minutes by the greed of a few men in suits. It reminds the USA audience that the safety they enjoy today on every ferry, every plane, and every crowded theater was bought with the lives of 1,000 people who just wanted to have a picnic on a sunny Wednesday in June. The music of Kleindeutschland is gone, but the lessons of the Slocum are anchored deep in the laws of the land, ensuring that such a carnival of neglect never sails again. The true end of the General Slocum story isn't found in the sinking of the ship, but in the permanent silence of a neighborhood that simply ceased to exist. In the years following 1904, the Lower East Side underwent a transformation so rapid and so total that it remains one of the most haunting demographic shifts in American history. The grief of the Germans was not just a metaphor, it was a physical evacuation. Men who had spent 30 years building businesses and raising families found that they could no longer walk past the local butcher shop or the corner bakery without seeing the faces of the wives and children they had lost to the river. By 1910, the German language, once the dominant tongue of the district, had been replaced by Yiddish and Italian. The vibrant culture of Kleindeutschland, with its brass bands and beer gardens, evaporated into the humid air of New York, leaving behind only the stone-carved names of German builders on the tops of tenement buildings. The legal legacy of the disaster became the foundation of modern American safety. Before the Slocum, the idea of a federal inspector was often a joke, a man who could be bought with a cheap cigar and a $10 bill. After the Slocum, the United States government realized that corporate greed was a lethal force. The disaster led directly to the creation of the Steamboat Inspection Service, which eventually merged into the modern U.S. Coast Guard. Every time you step onto a ferry today and see a stack of orange life vests or a clear map of emergency exits, you are looking at a safety manual written in the blood of the St. Mark's congregation. The Slocum laws ensured that never again would a manufacturer be allowed to put iron bars inside a life jacket just to save a few cents on cork. The ship itself, the General Slocum, had a final eerie act. After being raised from the mud near North Brother Island, the charred and hollowed-out hull was sold and turned into a coal barge. For years, the vessel that had once been a floating palace hauled soot and dirt up and down the Atlantic coast, a ghost of its former self. In 1911, it finally sank for the last time during a storm off the coast of New Jersey, as if the Atlantic itself was finally reclaiming the cursed wood. No one died in the second sinking. The ship simply slipped into the dark water, ending its journey as a silent underwater wreck. Today, if you take a boat past North Brother Island, you will see a dense green forest in the middle of the East River. It is a forbidden zone, a bird sanctuary where the ruins of the old hospitals where survivors were once treated are being swallowed by ivy and trees. It is a mid-river tomb, a place where the city's busiest waterway turns suddenly quiet. In Tompkins Square Park, the small marble fountain remains the only physical monument to the 1,021 souls. The story of the General Slocum is a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates, but a series of lives that were changed forever by a single hour of negligence. It is the story of how a sunny picnic became the darkest day in New York's history, leaving a legacy of safety that protects millions of people who have never even heard the ship's name.
The final legacy of the General Slocum is written in the very laws that govern the modern world, though its name has faded from the headlines. After the mourning subsided and the black wreaths were removed from the doors of the Lower East Side, the United States entered a new era of accountability. The disaster served as the brutal catalyst for the Steamboat Inspection Act of 1905, which stripped away the honor system that corporations had enjoyed for decades. No longer could a ship's captain skip fire drills or a manufacturer fill life jackets with iron and sawdust.
The tragedy forced the federal government to realize that safety was not a luxury, but a fundamental right of every passenger. As the years rolled into the 1920s and 30s, the survivors of the Slocum became a quiet, aging fraternity. They watched as the world changed, as cars replaced horses, and as the German language they once spoke in the streets of Manhattan became a whisper of the past. The Slocum Relief Society, once a massive organization helping thousands of orphans and widowers, slowly dwindled until only a handful of elderly men and women remained. They met every June 15th at the Marble Fountain in Tompkins Square Park, standing in the shadow of the trees, a small island of memory in a city that was constantly rebuilding itself. The physical ship, the General Slocum, met a poetic end. After its charred hull was raised and converted into a lowly coal barge, it spent years hauling the very fuel that had once powered its engines. In 1911, during a fierce Atlantic gale off the coast of New Jersey, the barge finally surrendered to the sea. It sank into the cold, dark waters of the Atlantic, taking its cursed history to the bottom. There was no fire this time, and no one was on board to hear the wood groan as it broke apart. It was as if the ocean itself was finally cleaning the slate. Today, the story of the General Slocum is a hidden history of the United States. It is a narrative of how a single hour of corporate negligence and systemic failure can delete an entire culture from a map. It serves as a haunting reminder to the American audience that the regulations we often complain about today, the safety checks at airports, the fire exits in theaters, the inspections of our ferries, were all paid for in advance by the lives of 1,021 people who just wanted to spend a Wednesday afternoon in the sun. The grief of the Germans is now a silent part of New York's bedrock. If you stand on the shore of the East River today and look toward the green, overgrown ruins of North Brother Island, you might feel a chill in the air that has nothing to do with the wind. It is the echo of a brass band, the flutter of white lace dress, and the memory of a community that went out for a picnic and accidentally changed the world forever.